These answer choices are interesting to me for a couple of reasons. First, we've got 5 answers that are numbers, so it gets me thinking we could probably test the answers. But secondly, if you look at the answer choices, you'll notice that they interact with one another. Answer choice A is twice what C is, and C is 4 times what E is. Even B is 3 times what D is. So there's clearly an issue of multiples here, which I find interesting. That might be something we can use against the prompt at a certain point. But let's go get the information and see what we're dealing with. When the positive integer x is divided by the positive integer y, the remainder is 9. So we've got x over y is something remainder 9. And we know that x and y are both integers. That is very specific. Next up, we learn that x over y is 96.12. That's really strange for a decimal. We'll end up talking about that in more detail in a second. And the question goes on to ask, what's the value of y? Well, this absolutely sets me up. I've got a locked-in value with the 9, a locked-in value with the 0.12, and I'm solving for one thing. We are absolutely going to test the answer choices here. Now let's talk about all the things that are going on. Because x and y are integers, I'm going to take that fact over here and multiply the y over. So x is equal to 96.12 times y. And that, again, means that an integer times this equals another integer. So there's got to be some way to get rid of that decimal point. And at first thought, I'd look at this and say, well, if y was 100, that would get rid of the decimal completely. But when you look at the answer choices, that's not an option. All the numbers here are smaller. So there's still got to be some way to get rid of that decimal point just by multiplying by something less than 100. And that's when I start thinking about number properties and math. And I think, well, how do you get rid of a 2 at the end? What would you have to multiply it by? Well, if you multiplied it by a 5, you'd get a 0, and that could make the decimal disappear. What that tells me is the answer's got to be B or D. If you multiply by A, C, or E, you won't make the decimal vanish, and it has to because x is a whole number. So it's got to be B, which is 75, or D, which is 25. And at this point, if you were looking at this and thinking this is way too much of a headache, then I agree. Take a guess and move on. You've done enough work to take an educated crack at this thing and move past it. But if you're going to solve, then you've got to finish this thing off by picking an answer, testing it, and seeing what happens. So let's try the 25. That certainly looks like the easier of the two options. So if you take 96.12 times 25, what do you end up getting? And this is not going to be fun math, but it is math that you can do, and the GMAT will occasionally expect you to do some calculations of this caliber. Just get it onto the pad, get it done, and let's see what occurs. 0.03042. So yes, the decimal disappears. 96.12 times 25 is 2403. So that would be the x, and the y would be 25. Now we're still not done because we got to see if this meshes with everything. It meshes with the 96.12, but what's the remainder when 2403 is divided by 25? And there's actually a great shortcut here. Because 25 goes into 100 and 200 and 300, it'll go into 2400 a certain number of times. So I'm just going to put the number sign here, and then you got to ask yourself what would be left over. What would the remainder be? And there would be 3 pieces left over, so remainder 3. But that doesn't match the remainder that you're supposed to have. Notice how 9 is 3 times greater than 3. I know D's not right, but also notice how 75 is 3 times greater than 25. That idea of multiples absolutely finishes this question off for us. It's got to be B. It's the only number that will do everything we need it to do and meshes with all the facts. In hindsight, this question is a real mess. It's a real bear no matter how you solve it. And I think what we just did here was the easiest method. There are mathy explanations that are just as bad, if not worse. And so in the end, you got to gauge this thing and say, is it worth my time? Could I have done this in 3 minutes or fewer? And if you can't, did you notice that ending in 5 would be enough to get rid of the decimal? Then you can take a guess. And if not, you either work it through or you take a shot at this thing and move past it. This thing wouldn't kill you if you got it wrong. It's really not too terrible of a question because it's so loaded with number facts and answers that are numbers that you can crack this thing by testing the answers. But there's a balance that must be maintained. And if you can't do this in under 3 minutes, then you should be taking a guess on it and moving on.